Well, sorry. Welcome everyone to Fruits of the Orchard. Tonight is Parsha Tetzaveh, and this is the second Parsha dealing with the Mishkan. The subject of this Parsha really is almost divided into two. The first half, except for the first paragraph, which will or passage that we'll mention later about lighting the menorah, is about the clothing of the Kohanim, of the priests. And the second part is about the dedication, the consecration of the Mishkan, the whole procedure that they went through, and the procedure of the Kohanim becoming sanctified in their avoda, in their spiritual work in the Mishkan. And it ends with the golden altar on which the Ketoret was brought. So we're going to start with an article in the Parsha. It's actually the second article. It's called Enclothement of Chesed. The enclothement of Chesed. So I have to go back a little bit to explain. In Parsha B'Shalach, which is approximately 3 weeks ago, many of you are probably at the class or watched the class. There was a whole subject that as Israel is leaving Egypt, so they come to the Reed Sea, and they are somewhat trapped by the Reed Sea, and the Egyptians are following with the intent of killing all of them. And right before the sea splits and Israel passes through, there are 3 verses that explain that how the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire came between Egypt and Israel. In other words, God was protecting Israel. And then Moshe stretches out his hand and sets the scene for the splitting of the sea. And there are 3 verses in a row that have 72 letters. That was one of the main focuses of our class a few weeks ago in Parsha B'Shalach. The meaning of that, and in brief, 72 equals the word chesed, loving kindness. And here we see that there are 3 verses in a row that have 72 letters, which is not a very high probability. I saw the number once. It's in I believe in the millions, one in many million, that you would have 3 verses in a row with 72 letters. And then we saw, though, that if you add 72 plus 72 plus 72 equals 216, which is Gevura, which is the sphera exactly opposite from Chesed, of strict judgment and order and strength and might. So here you have the 2 seeming opposites of Chesed, 72 letters in the 3 verses, but they all add up to be Gevura. So we learned that which was Chesed for Israel was Gevura for the Mitzrim, for the Egyptians. And we discussed it at length. And part of that, and it's important for what we're going to be learning in this week's Parsha, is that from these 3 verses comes 72 3-letter names of God. And the way we get it is a very mystical way, by taking the first letter of the first verse, the last letter of the second verse, and the first letter of the third verse. That forms the first 3-letter name of God. The second one would be the second letter in the first verse, the second last letter in the second verse, and the second letter of the third verse. That forms the second name. So we end up with 72 3-letter names of God. These names are mentioned extensively in Kabbalah, especially the Kabbalah of the Arizal. And that's what we discussed. And then the next parsha after Bishalach is Yitro. That is the parsha where we receive the Torah. And we mentioned that parsha has exactly 72 verses. So here we see two parshas in a row where 72, and we simply can deduce from this that God giving the Torah to Israel and really to the whole world was a supreme act of chesed on God's part. Now we are coming to this parsha. All this was an introduction because now we're going to see the number 72 appear a number of times in the clothing of the high priest. And so here we see this number 72 is following us. And again, 72 is chesed. And as we'll learn a little bit later, the Kohanim represent chesed. And especially Aharon a Kohen. He's called Ish Chesed. And Hillel HaZaken said in Pirkei Avot that we should be students of Hillel who loved peace. And I'm not sure what happened here. I'm sorry, but anyone who opened up this meeting notes needs to close this. Thank you, Toby. Okay. So Aaron represents chesed, and we're going to see now 3 instances where 72 appear in the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. So the first one is in the Parsha, the Kohen Gadol wears a me'il. It's a long robe. And on the bottom, the Torah says there will be pomegranates and bells. The pomegranates were made out of material, cloth material, and the bells were real bells that when he walked, you could hear the tinkling of the bells. There's actually a disagreement in the Gemara exactly how they were placed, because in the Torah it says that you should make these pomegranates and these bells, and it says the bells within the pomegranates, but then it says a pomegranate and a bell, a pomegranate and a bell. So it sounds like almost 2 different things, and that's what the disagreement is. Some said that because it says that the bells were within the pomegranates. Now it could mean that we're within each of the pomegranates around the hem of the robe of the ma'il. Or it could mean that it was every other one. As the verse says, a pomegranate and a bell, a pomegranate and a bell. Nonetheless, however we learn it, that's what was on the bottom of his robe. And it says that when he would come into the sanctuary and he'd be walking, you would hear the sound of the bells. So by tradition, there were 72 bells and 72 pomegranates. So again, we have this number which equals chesed, and it's actually doubled. So if you double 72, it is 144. 144 is 12 squared. Now we're going to see all of this fits together is because along with this robe, there was what's called the ephod, was like an apron on top of the robe. And part of the ephod was what was called the choshen mishpat, this square object that hung from his shoulders, and it had the 12 tribes inscribed on 12 stones. So here, all of these numbers are very significant. The breastplate, thank you, in English, the breastplate. The choshen mishpat, the breastplate of judgment. And he wore it over his heart. And there were 4 rows. All of this is explained in this week's parsha. There were 4 rows with 4 precious stones embedded in the breastplate. And on these stones were written the names of the tribes of Israel. So here we have 72 pomegranates and 72 bells, equaling 12 squared. And we have 12 in another place. On the shoulder, on the both shoulders of the Kohen Gadol, there was a Evan Shoham. And on it were 6 tribes were inscribed on one shoulder and 6 tribes on the other shoulder. So here we see in 2 different places, 12 squared, 2 different places, we have the names of the tribes of Israel. So this is the first place where 72 appears. And while we're on the subject, we'll say that the symbolism is very, very striking. And it even says in the Torah that when the Kohen Gadol would wear the breastplate, it would be over his heart, and that he would carry the names of Israel over his heart. So the meaning of this is obvious. The Kohen Gadol, we have to understand, in the first temple, and the second temple was already changing, but in the first temple, there were not synagogues the way we know today. There were no Beit Knesset. All of the service for all of Israel was done in the temple for all of Israel. So that's the significance of the Kohen Gadol wearing the names of the tribes, but it was on his heart. He was doing the service from his heart for the sake of all of Israel. Not that people didn't pray. There's a mitzvah to say the Shema every day, for men to put on the tefillin, but there wasn't organized prayer the way we know it today. The organized service was in the temple for all of Israel. Already by the end of the second temple, the beginning of the Beit Knesset system, synagogue system, and prayers as we know them today, which were formulated by the Anshe Knesset Gedola, the men of the Great Assembly. And by the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, there was already a smooth transition into all of Israel, in a sense, continuing the service in the temple. So here we see the Kohen Gadol wearing the breastplate with the names of Israel on it. We just discussed that significance, but also on the shoulder. So this is like a modern expression of the feeling of holding the weight of the whole world on one's shoulders. So this might even be the actual source of that whole concept, because the Kohen Gadol had the names of the 12 tribes inscribed on these 2 stones that he wore on his shoulders. And he quite literally, especially because he was doing the service in the name of and for the sake of all of Israel. So he was holding in a sense, all of Israel on his shoulders. So these are just very, very beautiful, beautiful ideas. So the second connection with the number 72 is when the tribes were written on the stones on the breastplate. So there's actually a disagreement. Are there 49 letters or 50 letters when you write out the tribes? The conclusion is really 50, because sometimes you could add, especially the name Benjamin, could have a yud or could not have a yud. So there were 50 letters, yet there was an oral tradition that we'll see in a second wasn't just oral, that there should be 72 letters on the 12 stones of the breastplate. So the tribes only came to 50 letters. So again, this was a tradition, but it became part of the actual, it wasn't just an oral tradition, it was in the breastplate. And the way they made up the 22 letters was they added the name Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the term Shivtei Yeshurun, the tribes of Yeshurun. Yeshurun is another term for Yisrael. It almost sounds very similar. Yisrael, Yeshurun. It's very similar letters. So the way they did it, though, well, where would the names Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov go? Where would the name Shiftei Yisrael go? Because you had the names of the tribes. So the way they did it is every stone had 6 letters. And since there were 12 tribes, 6 times 12 equals 72. So there wasn't the whole name Avram or the whole name Yitzhak or the whole name Yaakov. It would be the name of the tribe, and then the number of letters from the 3 patriarchs that it would take to fill up that stone to 6 letters. Because some of the tribes, their names only had 3 letters or 4 letters or 5 letters. So that's how it was done. And again, though, we see the number 72, chesed. So we're starting to see, going back to crossing the Reed Sea, a manifestation of God's chesed in the miracles at the Reed Sea, at the giving of the Torah, Parshat Yitro, 72 verses. And here, in the clothing of the high priest, who represented all of Israel. So we've now discussed 2 different manifestations of 72. Really, in a sense, 3, because there were 72 bells and 72 pomegranates. And here we have the 72 letters on the breastplate. But now there's even one more, and that is in the breastplate, there was like an inner pocket. And in the inner pocket, the Torah just doesn't really tell us what it was, but it was called the Urim and Tumim. Urim comes from the word or, light. Tumim comes from the word tam, or tamim, which means wholeness, completeness. So light and completeness. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us what these Urim were, what these Tumim were that were in this pocket behind the breastplate. But the Talmud explains that the Urim and Tumim were, and there's some discussion But Rashi says, Shem HaMefurash. What were these Urim and Tumim? What were these lights and symbol of completeness? Was the name, a four-letter name of God. That's the right. Usually when you say Shem HaMefurash, it means the four-letter name of God. But the Baal HaTurim brought a different tradition, that it was the 72, not the 72 three-letter names of God, but there's also what's called the 72-letter name of God. And according to the Baal HaTurim, that is what was in the pocket. Now, he even brings a gematria. He says the gematria of et ha'urim, wait 1 second, ha'urim v'ha'turim, ha'tumim, ha'urim v'ha'tumim equals Shem ben Shivim B'Shtayim, the name of 72 letters. This is from the Baal HaTurim. So I'll say that again. He said that the numerical value of these words, Urim v'Tumim, equals the name of 72. So that was the tradition of the Baal HaTurim. So here again, we see the number 72. Now, what was the purpose of having these names here? So on one level, you could just say, just like the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, was carrying the weight and the destiny and the responsibility of all of the 12 tribes on his heart, we could say also that the name of God was on the heart of the high priest. There's actually a hint to this, because when Moshe, God is instructing Moshe how to make the 2 tablets. And the first tablets, God said, it will be inscribed with the finger of God. And the Torah describes it as charut ala luchot, engraved on the luchot. In other words, the 10 commandments were engraved on the luchot. So the Talmud says, don't read it charut, engraved, read it cherut, freedom, freedom on the tablets. In other words, these mitzvot, these 10 commandments, all 613 mitzvot of the Torah, are meant to give us a roadmap to personal, spiritual, physical freedom. Very, very important message. Don't read it charut, engraved on the tablets. Read it cherut, freedom on the tablets. And these tablets are, in many, many different commentaries, are compared to the 2 ventricles of the heart. Just like there's 2 tablets, the heart and the lungs, the idea of that this freedom, that the Torah should be engraved on the heart, on our innards, on our what's called panemius, on our inner life. So here we have the idea of 72. So we've seen it run all the ways through. And now I just want to go back to this idea that we discussed at the crossing of the sea, where the 3 verses that have 72 letters, if you add them together, have 216 letters. 72 times 3 equals 26 equals Gevura. So you have both Chesed and Gevura in a sense, the same actions. So it's very interesting, because we already mentioned that Aaron is called Ish Chesed, a man of loving kindness. And yet, when we look at the Sfirot, and especially, let's say, on Sukkot, when we invite the Ushpizim, the seven patriarchs and special guests to our Sukkah, so each one of the seven guests is associated with one of the Sfirot. Avram is Chesed, Yitzhak is Gevura, Yaakov is Teferet, Moshe is Netzach, and Aaron is Hod. But Hod is on the left side. Chesed is on the right side. So here we see there's some kind of complementary duality happening, because Aaron is placed on the left side, right below Gevura. And yet he's called an Ish Chesed. And so this tells us that this idea of what we call inter-inclusion, in Hebrew, hith kalalut, very, very important idea of how things merge together, inter-inclusion. So Aaron, on one hand, was placed in Hod, which is on the side of Gevura, but Hod itself means glory and praise and thanksgiving and confession. And you can see all of those in Aharon and the avoda in the Beit HaMikdash, where we have the all of these elements, especially glory, because the clothing of the high priest and all of the Kohanim was, it's described as for the glory of God. And now we'll mention that, for those who are aware, the Kohanim are actually from the tribe of Levi. And we'll call it a branch of the tribe of Levi, but they're always from the tribe of Levi. It's just that one family in the tribe of Levi was separated out to be the Kohanim. And that was Aharon and his descendants. So what's interesting is, usually when we talk about the Levites, the Levi'im, we do talk about them as being Gevura. If you look at the story of Levi, one of the 12 tribes, so in a number of different instances, he represented Gevura, very strong Gevura. On the other hand, Aaron is associated with Chesed. So there's a tradition that in the future, the Leviim will become also Kohanim. In other words, this is like an inter-inclusion that will only reach its final fulfillment or manifestation in the future, where Chesed and Gevura will be united together. Just like Aaron is both Hod and Chesed, two opposite sides of the Sfirot. And right now, the Levim are always associated with the left side, but we're told in the future, they will be incorporated into the right side as well. So that's just a beautiful inter-inclusion there. Okay, now we're going to go to the first article in Fruits of the Orchard, and it's called Beyond Names. All of the commentaries point out that from the time that Moshe is introduced in the Torah in Parshat Shemot, so he, in a sense, is the major figure for the rest of the Torah, and he's mentioned over and over and over again in all of the Parshas, except this one, except Tetzaveh. His name does not appear. So the usual explanation that is brought down is that after the sin of the golden calf, when Moshe is pleading for the people, And he says, God says, please move out of my way. I will destroy the people and I will make a new people out of you. A pretty amazing offer. In other words, Moshe could become the new Abraham. God will, as it were, I have to be clear, that was never God's intention, but he said this, and he began the verse saying, please move out of my way. So Rashi says that because God said it in that way, it was like a hint to Moshe. In other words, please get out of my way. Well, what happens if Moshe won't get out of his way? Then in a sense, he can't destroy the people. But that's what God was hinting to him. But it was just an expression of how upset God was that as he is giving over the Torah to Moshe, after 40 days, they go and they make a golden calf. But at that point, Moshe is pleading for the people, and he says, if you contemplate such a thing, wipe me out of the book that you have written. In other words, I will have no part of this. Wipe me out of the book, erase me from the book that you have written. So there's a concept in the Gemara, when a tzaddik, a righteous person, says something, in a sense, it has to be manifest on some level. Well, God didn't wipe out Moshe from his book, and he did accept Moshe's pleas, and he did forgive the people. But the sages explain that Moshe's statement, wipe me out of your book, had to be manifest in some way. So they say that's why his name is not mentioned in this parsha, to fulfill the fact that his words were important and had to be manifest. Another explanation, call it more mystical explanation, is that when Moshe said that, wipe me out of the book that you have written, this was in a sense, the ultimate statement or offer of what's called Mesirut Nefesh. He was willing to give up his life for the people. He was willing to be wiped out of this world, wiped out of the Torah. So that took incredible self-sacrifice on the part of Moshe. And so it's explained in Chassidut, the fact that Moshe's name is not mentioned, the first word is Ve'ata Tetzaveh, and you shall command Israel. And the rest of the parsha, God either says to Moshe, you, or in verb form, you should do this, you should do that, you should do this, you should command that. All in the second person. So Chassidut explains that there is something very, very special about a person's name. We know that the name of any entity is the essence of that entity. That's what it means when it said that Adam gave names to all of the animals. And the tradition is that Adam looked at the animal and he could perceive which Hebrew letters would not just represent, but what was the essence of this animal as it is manifest in the Hebrew letters. But it wasn't just the animals. Adam was able to look at every entity and could perceive the inner life force, the inner dynamic as mirrored through the Hebrew letters. So this is true of all of our names. That's why our names are very important. And the words in the Torah are important because each word is not just a linguistic representation of how we create language. It is an explanation of the actual essence of each and every entity in the world. For example, if you take the word God, we would ask, well, what do we know about God from the letters G-O-D? So we would say nothing, basically. But what happens if you take, let's say, the four-letter name of God, Yud and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey? Well, you could write a book of 1,000,000 pages about that name based on those four letters. And in fact, Rav Ginsburg's very, very first book, Sod Hashem Li Re'av, The Secret of God are for those who have awe of him. The entire book is basically about the name Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, the whole book. So we know that names are important, but there's also a level of beyond names. It's the same thing with God. There are many, many names of God. Each one is very, very important, very, very important. But there's a place where God is beyond names, beyond description. There is no ultimate description of God's infinite essence. So here, because of Moshe's tremendous mesirut nefesh, self-sacrifice, or willing for self-sacrifice. So here, in a sense, he's rewarded by God addressing him directly as you. Now we see a similar thing with Avraham. When Avram was given the commandment of Brit Milah, of circumcision, and God explains that this will be the sign of the covenant between me and the Jewish people. And at that point, he changes Avram's name from Avram to Avraham. Now we know that anytime a name is changed is very significant. It means that the person has risen to a whole different level. And yet, right after the revelation of what the covenant is, and Avram goes ahead and he circumcises himself, and at that point it was Yishmael. That's the end of Parshat Lech Lecha. And then we have Parshat Vayera, and it says, Vayera Hashem Elav, V'hu Yoshev B'petach HaOel. And God appeared to him, and he sat at the opening of the tent. What's significant is Avram's name is not mentioned. It doesn't say, and God appeared to Avraham, and Avram was sitting at the opening of his tent. It just says he appeared to him. And so the idea here is that, and there are many, many Torahs from Reb Shlomo about this, because in the Torah, all it says is God appeared to Avram, and it doesn't tell us what happened. What was the revelation? What was the realization? And so Reb Shlomo explains that even though Avram just became Avraham, and that's incredibly significant, here God was teaching him one more level of covenant that's beyond names, beyond what's called reason, beyond ratzon, beyond reason. So this is very, very connected to the beginning of this parsha, where God addresses Moshe as you, like very, very personal. Okay, now I want to add one more level here. And for those who have Orchard of Delights, we're learning Fruits of the Orchard. This is written up extensively in this week's Parsha in Orchard of Delights. But it's based also on the first word, ve'ata, and you. So Rav Ginsburg reveals that the gematria ve'ata Tetzaveh. Remember, the name of this parsha is called Tetzaveh, which means you shall command. So the gematria of ve'ata Tetzaveh equals Bereshit, equals 913. So what's the connection? That's the obvious question. What does V'ata Tetzaveh have to do with in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth? So Rav Ginsburg explains. It's really a quite amazing Torah. If you take the letters of V'ata and you permute them, the same letters equals the word ta'ava, which means passion or a desire. Ta'ava. Or in the vernacular, a taiva. In many, many cases, this word is used in a negative connotation. The lower desires and passions, many times produced by the nefesh, the animal soul, the physical material desires of this world. But there's also holy passion and holy desire. And so he explains that there are a number of different reasons that are proposed for why did God create the world. And Rav Ginsburg explains there's four basic ones. And one is Ein melech below am. There's no king without a people. In other words, there's something intrinsic about the very nature or essence of God that is related to his being a king. Like we say 100 times a day, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, O God, Elokeinu melech haolam, our God, the king of the universe, of the cosmos. So there's something very intrinsic about God being a melech, but there's no melech if there's no people. If there's no creation, there's no melech. So in a sense, for God to manifest part of his essence, there had to be a Bereshit, there had to be a world, there had to be ultimately Am Yisrael. A second reason is that God wanted to do good. So this is very connected to the whole first part of our class about chesed. And that's why we have a pasuk, Olam chesed yibaneh. A world of chesed God will build. That the desire of God to give led to the creation. Another one comes from the Zohar, that God wanted to be known. That, and again, we'll say this was called lahavdil, with many different, just like a person wants to be recognized, a person who has a talent, they want to do it in the world. They want to have it come to fruition in the world. And there's a natural tendency, obviously it can get blown out of all proportion, of wanting to be known. So God also, but on a whole different level than our wanting to be known, because God wanted to share his wisdom. That's what we say every morning, Kulam b'chachma asita. You made everything with wisdom. And God wanted to share that wisdom with a recipient. It goes along with God wanting to do chesed. Goes along with God wanting to be king. And the last one, this is the one that we're getting to, is a statement that I've mentioned many times. It's in the Midrash, Midrash Tanchuma. That God had a passion, a desire to have for himself a dwelling place in the lower worlds. Someone once asked the Alter Rebbe, like, how do we understand desire and passion when it comes to God? And especially this kind of a statement that God had a desire to have a dwelling place in the lower worlds. And the Alter Rebbe said, about this kind of divine passion, we don't ask questions. We there's no way we can comprehend. Nonetheless, we have this oral tradition that this is one of probably the most enigmatic and maybe the most profound reasons that despite God being infinite, being beyond time and space, somehow God had a passion to have a dwelling place in the lower worlds. And nothing represents this more than the big picture of what we're talking about here is the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And as we mentioned last week, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, becomes the prototype of the temple in Jerusalem. And the temple in Jerusalem becomes the prototype of our synagogue. And just like we are going in future parshas going to describe the avoda, the spiritual service in the Mishkan, well, that became the prototype in the temple. And that was reformed into our prayers today. So that's why these parshas are so important, even though it seems like we don't have a Mishkan, we don't have a temple. Why are we learning this? We're learning this because it is a microcosm of the entire world. And we learn about our avoda today, our spiritual service today. So what's interesting in this parsha, I mentioned that the first passage, what is this first statement? Ve'ata tetzaveh, and you shall command. So it's commanding Aaron to light the menorah. So what's interesting is after the first verse of the Torah, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The first explicit creation where it says, and God said, let there be something, and there was, is light. So it's significant that the two words, Ve'ata tetzaveh, the opening words of this portion, equals Bereshit. And the first subject of this parsha is light, of lighting the menorah, to bring light into the world. So this is a very, very beautiful connection. Now I want to make a connection to this month of Adar and the holiday of Purim that's coming. And that is this month, Adar. It's explained that we can read it according to its syllables. Aleph, Dar, Adar. The Aleph represents God. And in fact, in the Talmud, today we have an expression for God, the master of the universe, Ribono Shel Olam, the master of the universe. In the Talmud, they had a very similar one, but it was Alufo Shel Olam, the Aleph of the world, because more names of God begin with an Aleph than any other letter. And the word dar means to dwell. Excuse me, that's why today an apartment is called a dira, excuse me. An apartment is called a dira, from the word dar. So it's explained in Hasidut, Adar means the Aleph, God, the divine, comes to dwell in this world. What does that mean? God dwells here all the time, all the months. But Adar is the last of the months. So it represents, in a sense, the lowest of the worlds. It's the end of the year of months. Nisan, the next month, will be the new year of months. Like Rosh Hashanah is a new year of years. The new year of months is in Nisan. So the idea of the Aleph Dar is very connected to Purim, because Purim, this is brought down extensively in Hasidut, the way that we're celebrating Purim, first of all, it's not like Shabbat or a holiday where certain works are forbidden. In other words, you don't have that kind of holiness that needs a suspension of work. On Purim, like, work continues. And we celebrate through eating and drinking, giving gifts, being joyous, playing music, even sometimes having what's called holy fun. All of this is on Purim. So you would think, well, it's pretty like light holiday, but it's explained that this is one of the deepest of all of the holidays, because here we're trying to bring the Aleph to dwell in the mundane. I mean, Shabbos is the holiest of holy. Yom Kippur, the holy of holiest. And here on Purim, though, we're just going about our lives. And here we're filling it with Kedusha. We're filling it with holiness and kavana and meaning. So that's this idea that God had a passion to have a dwelling place in the lower worlds, is represented by the month of Adar, Aleph Dar, the Aleph dwells. And that is most represented in the holiday of Purim. Now, it says in the Zohar, an amazing thing, in the Torah, the day of Yom Kippur is always called Yom HaKippurim. Not Yom Kippur, but Yom HaKippurim. So the Zohar says an amazing thing. It says, don't read it Yom HaKippurim, read it Yom Kippurim. Like an amazing drasha here. Yom Kippur is a day like Purim. So he would say, it's like the exact opposite. We're fasting. We're in shul all day. We're praying. We're doing tshuva. How can you compare Yom Kippur to Purim? Not only that, but Purim comes about 1,000 years after Yom Kippur was given. But what they're trying to do is make a point here, is that, like, what would we do without Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur really is the holy of holiest. But there is something even holier about Purim, if you understand it and do it that way. What do I mean? Many, many people get very drunk and not necessarily in a very spiritual way. Let's just say it that way. They mean well. I went through it myself too many times. So I learned my lesson. I really didn't understand what Purim was all about. Yes, we're supposed to drink, and even drink quite a bit, but it's a spiritual kind of drinking. It's drinking with deep kavana. I wish we had more time But anyone who has my book, Seasons of the Soul, there's a whole chapter on Purim, including the whole idea of drinking on Purim and where we're supposed to get to. But I'll just mention a little bit here before we end, is one of the main teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, and it became one of the innovations of the beginning of the Hasidic movement, is the Baal Shem Tov said, it's a verse in Psalms, B'chol derachecha te'ehu. In all of your ways, know him. It's either Tehillim or Mishlei, the Psalms or Proverbs. In all of your ways, know him. So the Baal Shem taught knowing God is not just through learning Torah and davening and meditating. It's through everything that we do. It's through eating, it's through working, it's through art, it's through relationships with people, it's through nature, it's through everything. In all of your ways, know him. Whatever you're doing is an opportunity to connect to God. This is one of the foundations of the Hasidic movement. So here we have the word de'ehu. In all of your ways, know him. Now, on Purim, we have this idea that we're supposed to drink ad delo yada, until we don't know. And the continuation is the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. And the way it's explained is we don't know, should we be happier that Mordechai was successful or that Haman was defeated? Because there is a certain joy when your team wins, and there's also a certain joy when your enemy, adversary, the rival team loses. So they say that you're supposed to drink on Purim until you don't know the difference of what you should be more joyous about. But it's taken like to a whole different level, this idea of ad delo yada, until you don't know. And so here we bring the well-known idea is that the greatest knowing is to not to know. In other words, is to know how much you don't know. In Kabbalah, it goes much, much, much deeper, much, much deeper, that the highest level of Keter is called Reisha Delo Yada Velo Ich Yada, the head that does not know and doesn't even know it's not known, and it doesn't even know itself. Meaning, going back to this idea of beyond names, there's a certain deep knowing in knowing your name or the name of something. But there's even a deeper knowing that goes beyond names, that we don't know what to call it. We're just connected. We're just connected to it. So here we have a great paradox, that the greatest knowing is to get to a level beyond knowing. And so this is connected to the whole idea of Adar, that there's a place that we can come to know God through all of our actions, everything that happens. And then there's a certain level of knowing God that's beyond the physical world altogether. And they're both true. They're both correct. They're both simultaneous. So this is the level of getting to Ad Delo Yada. It's actually the highest knowledge. And actually, if you take the words Ad Delo Yada, you could read it Ad delo kama yada, until the no, meaning no, until the part of you that is negative or doesn't know comes to know. I'll say that again. Ad delo kama yada, until the level of not knowing comes to this higher level of knowing that is not knowing. That's a Purim drasha, if I ever heard one. Okay, so we'll end with a recap here. Is we followed the number 72, chesed, through the splitting of the Red Sea, the giving of the Torah, the clothing of the high priest, the whole avoda of the high priest to carry the names of Israel on his heart and in his shoulders. And then we learned that one of the reasons that God created the world was he wanted to do chesed. So we see this running through all of creation. And of course, we know that the first Jew, Avram, was the greatest revelation of chesed. And then we saw that Avram gets his name Avraham, but there's a level that God addresses Avram beyond names. And the same thing with Moshe in this parsha. He's not mentioned because there's a certain level where God was teaching Moshe that our connection is beyond names. That's what a covenant is. A covenant is a type of relationship. It's called beyond tam v'dat, beyond logical reason or precedent. The type of covenant between God and Israel really has no precedent in world history, especially when looking at Jewish history, what we have gone through to survive and thrive. And so we ended with ultimately the idea that God had a passion to be in this world with us. It's such an incredible thing. And through our avoda, through all of your ways, know him, we bring the aleph dar, we bring the aleph down into this world, and we become the Mishkan where God can dwell.